might be interested. And he led me to Mary Turk Meena. I also saw her, I'm a member of the Gettysburg Foundation, and in their magazine, I saw they had the spring roster, and they always had speakers during that weekend. And again, I saw her name in there, so I gave her a call, and then we went over I think a couple of programs that she does, and I said, well, you know what, I think we need to take a walk down Hancock Avenue, just to find out what's going on. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Mary Turk Meena, and I'd like for us to her silver round table to give her a nice warm welcome.
All right, and this is honor. Oh, okay. It's really loud. Oh, there you go. All right. Okay, so, well, Rick works with that. Let me just introduce myself a little bit. I am oh gosh, I'm not going to be able to see anybody. I'm a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg National Military Park after 35 years of practicing law. That was a whole lot of fun, but it was time to do something else, and this seemed like a really neat thing to do until I realized what the testing process was like. And golly, it was really fun, let me tell you. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And so I've been a guide now for about 6 years. For 6 years, this is my 7th year guiding. And as Tom said, I've done a number of programs for the Gettysburg Foundation. I do leadership programs for the Gettysburg Foundation and for some other organizations there as well. And then general tours on the battlefield. So it's fun for me to do a tour for you down Hancock Avenue. But having talked to several of you, I may ask you as many questions as you're going to ask me, because it sounds to me as though you all know what's going on Hancock Avenue. But we will we'll do that, and maybe there's some information I have that you haven't heard. Maybe it's new, as somebody said, maybe it's a different perspective. But we'll take that stroll down. What I'd like to do is make this as interactive as possible, because again, I think this is a very knowledgeable audience. So, so let's get started. Just taking a look at this photograph, and as you can tell, I went out and photographed on the battlefield a few days ago with the snow still there. This is looking south from about the 71st Pennsylvania Monument, right at the angle. And we see several monuments that we'll be talking about in the distance: Big Round Top, Little Round Top, the stone wall, right along. Can you guys over here see that okay? Stone wall here. We'll talk about some fences as well, because it's not all about monuments. But that at least gives us a sense of what it looks like and looked like 4 days ago. Okay, and you're going to do the slides for me, so let's go to the next slide. Here's what it looked like circa 1910. This is a postcard that was put out in 1910, and again, it's not quite the same view, it's an aerial view, but here is Hancock Avenue. Here's the U.S. Regulars Monument, the Pennsylvania Monument, looking toward Big Round Top, Little Round Top, but you're going to notice a couple of different things in this photograph, right? So first of all, we've got in here, by the way, is George Meade's statue. We're going to start our walk at George Meade's statue. What the heck is this?
Yeah.
Anybody know?
Shortcut to the Leicester House.
Well, it was. It's Meade Avenue.
Ah, okay.
It was Meade Avenue that was there. It's now a walking path from Hancock Avenue down to the Leicester House, his headquarters, of course. But as a road, it no longer exists. So that road's there. And what the heck is this? It's a loop. A road. You could drive your car right around that loop, right down the stone wall to the angle and back out again, called Webb Avenue. Alexander Webb, of course, the brigade commander of the Philadelphia Brigade. So it looks a little bit different, doesn't it? And you'll also notice there's some things missing. There's really no stone wall here. So there have been some changes, some improvements along Hancock Avenue as well. So that just gives you a sense of some of the changes that have taken place. And let's talk just a little bit about just what Hancock Avenue is. Hancock Avenue was originally laid out in 1882. At that time, the battlefield was under the preservation of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, a private group that was started about 6 months after the battle. Their job, what they wanted to do, was preserve the battlefield. So as more and more visitors came to the battlefield, they started to lay out roads. And they did that where roads didn't exist at the time of the battle. Hancock Avenue was one of those roads. And then when the park was handed over to the U.S. War Department in 1895, the U.S. War Department, of course, the government gets in and they improve the road. So they put down Telford, which is sort of a blacktop substance. And so that's what you see there. By 1910, it's been improved a couple more times. The route has been changed a little bit over time, but generally, these roads were placed on the battlefield. Is everybody on mute?
Yeah. Anybody on Facebook or Zoom, please mute.
So generally, these roads were placed along battle lines. And this one, of course, along the Cemetery Ridge battle line. You can distinguish those roads that were added to the battlefield over roads that existed at the time of the battle because they're called avenues. Hancock Avenue, Reynolds Avenue, United States Avenue. Those are all added roads by the various preservation groups that were there. If it's a road, the Tawnytown Road, the Emmetsburg Road, the Wheatfield Road, it was there at the time of the battle. So that's how you tell the difference when you get to Gettysburg. Okay, so let's go go to 2 slides down. Okay, George Meade, right? Why does George Meade in this statue have his hat off? Every other equestrian statue on the battlefield, the rider has his hat on. Why is George Meade's hat off? Because when George Meade rode up to Cemetery Ridge as Pickett's charge is being repelled, what does he do? He takes his hat off. And there are several eyewitnesses that say George Meade rode up. He's been chased away by the Confederate artillery. It hits the Leicester House, his headquarters, so he goes further back the line, which is what the commanding general should do. He rides up. He's told that Pickett's men are now retreating, and he takes his hat off, the eyewitness says, as if to cheer. But then he looks at the devastation across the battlefield in front of him and merely says, thank God. That's why his hat's off on this monument. So George Meade, I'm sure you all know a lot about George Meade. It's always sad to me that so many people come to the battlefield and don't know about George Meade. They think Ulysses S. Grant was at Gettysburg.
Oh, jeez.
I know you guys know better than that.
Wow.
George Meade was there, and he was incredibly competent at Gettysburg. He did some amazing things, and I kind of ran through this program this morning, and I talked about George Meade for about a half an hour. I'm not going to do that tonight. He's one of my favorite guys, because I think he gets a bad rap at Gettysburg.
Yes, he does.
And I don't think he deserves that. But they finally put a monument up to George Meade. George Meade is from Philadelphia, born in Cadiz, Spain, where his father is an international merchant, but his father loses most of his money in the Spain-Portugal War, so the family returns to Philadelphia, and George, one of the 8th of 11 children, pains me to say.
No TV.
Big families back then. Grows up, his father dies while he's still young, but he's pretty well connected politically, and so he gets an appointment to West Point. He'll spend his time between the graduation and the Civil War most of it as a civil engineer in the United States Army. He's involved in breakwater construction and lighthouse construction along the East Coast. From everywhere, see you're nodding, so I'm telling you stuff you guys already know. So we'll get to some stuff you don't know. He, from New Jersey down to Florida. Where's George Meade when the war breaks out?
Michigan.
Detroit. What's he doing?
Working on the Great Lakes stuff.
Yeah, okay. We
Lighthouse.
bought Louisiana Purchase, right, in 1803. By 1861, we're still figuring out what we bought. And George Meade is in charge of the survey of the Great Lakes in 1861. He'll come east, get a command, and in the first 2 years of the war, he works his way up through every level of command, demonstrating not only personal courage, but competence. None of these generals have any experience that will be useful during the Civil War. They've not commanded large numbers of men on a battlefield. They don't know anything about logistics. And George Meade proves in those first 2 years of the war that he can get men to the battlefield with the equipment they need, with the food that they need to be good, competent soldiers. And he handles them well on a battlefield. So it should be, although it seems to be today, no surprise that George Meade, once Joseph Hooker loses the confidence of the senior commanders around him, it should be no surprise that they recommend George Meade for command. George Meade, at this point, is married. He marries Margaretta Sargent, a well-connected political family in Philadelphia. They have 7 children and a lifelong love affair. George writes to her often, and his letters, who's read his letters? Yeah, they're fabulous. So George will write to his wife a few days before June the 28th. I know there's all this scuttlebutt about a change of command of the Army of the Potomac. Honey, it's not going to be me, because I don't have any political friends in Washington. It's all about politics. Well, a couple of days later, he'll write to his wife again and say, hey, guess what, honey? I'm now in command, but he'll tell her about the events of that night. I'm awakened in the middle of the night by a messenger from Washington who tells me I've come to bring you trouble. George thinks he's about to be removed from command. But the officer says, no, it's worse than that. You're now in charge. And he'll try and talk his way out of it, but it's an order. He's a soldier. He'll take command. And he does some remarkable things at Gettysburg. And someday we'll do a Meade program and talk about some of those remarkable things. We just don't have time to talk about it tonight. I'm sorry. So let's talk quickly about Meade after the war. We know what happens at Gettysburg. You all are familiar. George Meade, after the war, after the surrender, will become a Reconstruction governor in the South and one of the commissioners of Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. But he dies of pneumonia at age 56 in 1872, weakened by the war. So here's his monument, placed on Cemetery Ridge. Planning began in 1891. It's paid for by Pennsylvania. How do you know that? And this is not a great picture to show that. But there's a plaque on the front of the monument with the Pennsylvania state seal on it. Every time you see a monument with a state seal on it, the state paid for that monument or paid a good portion of the cost of that monument. It is sculpted by Henry Kirk Bush Brown, who did several other beautiful equestrian monuments on the battlefield. He got paid $30,000 to make this statue. So placed in the late 1800s. When does the Virginia Monument get placed on the battlefield? 1917. And what is Robert E. Lee doing on top of that monument? Staring at George Meade. They stare at each other across the Emmitsburg Road, across the ground of Pickett's charge, perhaps another act of defiance by the South. So we can't leave this monument, and you can go to the next slide, please.
There we go.
Okay, we all know what George Meade looks like, right? Kind of a curmudgeonly guy. It's a little bit of a reason why George Meade is not popular. He doesn't like newspaper reporters. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so we got to talk about the horse. The horse that George Meade has, this is Old Baldy, and obviously a picture taken during the Civil War. Old Baldy was purchased by George Meade in 1861 for $150. He will ride Old Baldy in a number of battles. Old Baldy, during the course of the war, will be wounded anywhere between 5 and 14 times.
Wow.
He's left on the Antietam battlefield for dead, wounded through the neck. And when they go to clean up the battlefield, they find Old Baldy just grazing away on what's left of the grass at Antietam. At Gettysburg, Old Baldy will be ridden by Meade again, wounded again, this time through the stomach, and he'll refuse to go forward. He'll recover again. But he's finally wounded for the last time at Petersburg in 1864, retired to a farm in Philadelphia, not too far from George Meade's home, and as George Meade continues to write home to his wife, he'll ask about Old Baldy. After the war, Old Baldy will be ridden several times by Meade in reunion parades. His last public appearance is as the riderless horse in George Meade's funeral. Old Baldy lives until he's 30 years old, finally put down in 1882. But if you've got a sense of humor, Old Baldy still lives today. Anybody know where Old Baldy lives today?
Union Place in Philadelphia.
Ah, you guys are
Philly GA,
wrong.
right?
I've seen
Yeah.
it, I've touched it.
It's on my
Careful.
bucket list. I haven't seen him yet. You've got to call and get into that
That's
museum.
right.
So I haven't seen him yet, but next slide, please.
There's old Baldy.
There's Old Baldy. They did, just about 2 weeks after he died, dig him up, cut his head and neck off, stuff him, and put him on
Your
display.
family's not gonna do that to you.
Well, nice, yeah. Well,
Aw. So Old Baldy
Rather
still
morbid.
lives.
poor guy.
All right, so let's go to the next slide. We're now going to talk about the Philadelphia Brigade. Philadelphia Brigade starts as what in the war?
California something.
California Brigade. Some bright guy decides that with all of the Pennsylvania recruits, they're more than what was required for Pennsylvania to raise to join the Army. Remember, beginning of the war, 16,000 soldiers in the entire United States Army, and about a third of them from southern states. Most of those will go back to the South, fight for the Confederacy. And then you've got to build these big armies. 16,000 men at the beginning of the war. 4 years later, over 3 million soldiers have served in all these Civil War era armies. So both countries raise these soldiers the same way. Every state gets an allocation. By the summer of 1861, Congress calls for 500,000 troops. And every northern state given a portion of that allocation. Pennsylvanians oversubscribe. And so we get Pennsylvania Reserve units, and we get the California Brigade recruited out of Philadelphia. But we've got a congressman from the West Coast who wants to keep the California soldiers in California. And it's going to be a short war anyway, so they never have time to get here. So these guys get to be the California Brigade, 4 regiments, 71st Pennsylvania, 69th Pennsylvania, 72nd Pennsylvania, and the 106th Pennsylvania will initially form the California Brigade. They'll go through most of 1861 as the California Brigade, but once this guy who puts them together for California dies at Baldwin-Wallace, they decide they'd much rather be the Philadelphia Brigade. So they now get Pennsylvania designations. The 71st Pennsylvania, by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, has 261 men. They start with 1,000. So down to 261, and we'll talk also about the 69th Pennsylvania, 284 men at Gettysburg. 72nd Pennsylvania, 380 men. 106th Pennsylvania, 280 men. These 1,200 soldiers defend the center of the Union battle line on July the 2nd and July the 3rd. So they will participate in the repulse of the late charge on the afternoon of July the 2nd, and then also endure not only the cannonade that precedes Pickett's charge on July the 3rd, but also repel Pickett's charge along the wall. This monument was dedicated in 1887, and we'll see a number of these dedicated in 1887, just in time for the 25th anniversary. And I can see you doing the math. When's the 25th anniversary? 1888. So they're getting these monuments ready. And it's shortly after Pennsylvania allocates $1,500 for every Civil War regiment to place a monument on the battlefield. So they'll put this monument on the battlefield, and you'll see above the shamrock on this monument, it says California Regiment. So every time I get somebody from California, I make sure they see this monument so they know that California some way had a connection with Gettysburg. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'm sure you recognize this monument as well, the 69th. Pennsylvania, and again, up along the stone wall, and I know you've all got that vision in your head, up along the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge. 69th, Pennsylvania. This monument was dedicated in 1887 as well, and it's about 150 yards south. I'm not really good at distances, but about 150 yards south of the 71st Pennsylvania monument, and the text on the monument indicates that it is placed close to the spot where their commander, Dennis O'Kane, was mortally wounded. On July the 3rd, he dies on July the 4th. And you'll see some Irish stuff on this, appropriate for St. Patrick's Day. The harp at the top of the monument, and a shamrock. What's the shamrock doing there?
Second Corps.
Yeah, Second Corps, right? So all of these, and we saw it on the 71st Pennsylvania monument, not many Irish in that regiment, but this is almost all Irish, but it's the Corps badge of Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps. So we'll see that on a lot of these monuments, and as these monuments are designed and placed on the battlefield, there are some rules that apply. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association sets those rules. They own the battlefield, and they tell you where you can put your monument, some of the things that have to be on the monument, but they allow the survivors to basically design the monument the way they'd like to. One of the requirements is that their Corps badge must be visible on the monument. So we'll see a lot of shamrocks on these monuments. And some of the monuments are more elaborate than others, but they're all designed by the survivors of these particular regiments. Again, Pennsylvania in 1887 allocated $1,500 for each regiment, and they'll start putting these monuments on the battlefield. We'll actually see another Corps badge up on Cemetery Ridge as well. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is the 106th Pennsylvania, part of that Philadelphia Brigade. And you'll notice, and again, keep that picture of the area around the angle in your head. Where does this monument stand? And I forgot the most important rule about your monument on the battlefield. The rule of the association is that it is placed on your battle line. Makes perfect sense for the Union, which defended almost the entire Battle of Gettysburg. So wherever they were lined up, and they know pretty well where they were lined up, that's where your monument goes. And most of these monuments will have flank markers, small markers on each side, showing the length of that particular line. Now, how do we know where these guys were? Well, there are 20,000 wounded that remain in Gettysburg after the battle. And they're telling stories. They're going out, if they're ambulatory, going out, visiting the areas on the battlefield where they fought. Reporters come, other journalists come, and they're starting to tell their stories. The most important part of this process is that in 1868 and 1869, the U.S. War Department sends General Gouverneur Warren to Gettysburg to create maps of the battlefield. And those maps show all the topographical features, Warren is a topographical engineer, and they show where the troop positions were. And it's largely those maps, along with John Batchelder, who kind of becomes the historian of Gettysburg, that will decide where the monuments go. Cemetery Ridge is one of the few places on the battlefield where there is a double line of defense. We've looked at the front line, the 71st Pennsylvania, the 69th Pennsylvania. They're the front row, and they're in multiple lines within that regiment. But then there's another set of regiments behind them, and that's the 106th Pennsylvania, and as we'll see, the 72nd Pennsylvania. So the 106th gets its position back east of the copse of trees. You can see the high water mark there in the back. That's where this monument's positioned. And it is said to be where they began their charge on the afternoon of July the 2nd, as Confederates broke through, many say broke through the line on July the 2nd. It's the 106th Pennsylvania that was charged with charging those men and pushing them back all the way to the Emmitsburg Road. So on this monument, first of all, where's that shamrock on this monument?
On the top.
3 drums.
Drums on the top. Pretty cool. Nice way to do it. And then we've got a nice bronze relief here, and if you'll go to the next slide, we'll take a closer look at that. That's the bronze relief. These buildings, right up here in the distance, are the Kodari Buildings, the big red barn that sits on the Emmitsburg Road today, which is not, by the way, the original barn. It's burned down about 3 times since the Battle of Gettysburg. This is what the barn looked like at the time and the house looked like, but this is their charge. And these wonderful bronze reliefs that are on many of these monuments show the action of what's going on here. So that's the 106th Pennsylvania. So the last regiment we have to talk about up on Cemetery Ridge as part of the Philadelphia Brigade is the 72nd Pennsylvania. And they're a unique group. They it's formed out of a militia unit that was active in Pennsylvania before the war. And they were a Zouave unit. So we can go to the next slide. This is what you want to wear on a battlefield, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, there were a lot of Zouave units, both in the north and the south, modeled after what was thought to be very fierce North African fighters that were French, and they wore these kind of outrageous uniforms. By 1863, most of them had realized it was pretty dumb to do this, and so they were in regular army blue or gray, whichever side they were on. But we've got the 72nd Pennsylvania, and there's a little bit of a controversy about where their monument was placed. And as a retired lawyer, I love law stories. So if you'll go to the next slide. Okay, so the 72nd Pennsylvania, very proud of the work they did at Gettysburg, as they should have been. In 1883, placed their first monument on the battlefield, and it's the earliest of the Philadelphia Brigade monuments. This kind of ugly, not very exciting monument. 72nd Pennsylvania. And when it came to the placement of this monument, they were already fighting with the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association because they wanted to be up at the wall. And the Battlefield Association said, nice try, but no. That's not where you lined up. You were lined up along with the 106th Pennsylvania. And most people say they were lined up on the other side, on the eastern side of Hancock Avenue. What is Hancock Avenue today? Well, they finally came to a compromise and allowed the 72nd Pennsylvania to put their monument here, about 80 feet east of the wall. So you can see, and this is their, of course, the current the more recent monument, but this one already controversial about the placement of this monument. So that gets up in 1883. And then in 1887, when the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania starts to allocate money for monuments, 72nd Pennsylvania says, hey, great, here's our chance to get a monument by the wall. And so they design a monument, and as part of that allocation of funds for these various monuments, there was a commission formed in the legislation, and that commission would decide where the monuments go. Well, that sounds great, except the Battlefield Association already thinks it's in charge of where the monuments go, and they have a little dispute. The Pennsylvania Commission was lobbied very hard by the 72nd Pennsylvania and agreed to allow them to put their monument 13 feet, 20 feet back from the wall. So they're getting closer, right? Now they're 20 feet back, and the Battlefield Association says, no. Back on the eastern side of Hancock Avenue. So we're not going to let you put it up by the wall, we're going to have you put it back behind the 106th Pennsylvania. Well, they didn't like that at all. Thought it was a great insult. They came, they lobbied, they lost. And so what does any red-blooded American do? They sued. And they sued the Battlefield Association for the right to put their monument up the wall. It went to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court twice. And in the meantime, they developed a backup plan. The stone wall up here, on the other side of the stone wall in 1887, 1888, was private property. And so they went to Mr. Kodari and said, can we buy a plot of land on the other side of the wall? And he, sure, pay me enough, you got it. So they bought a square of land on the western side of the wall in front of the 69th Pennsylvania and 71st Pennsylvania. And then they let everybody know. Well, compromise finally comes. The Supreme Court finally rules in their favor, but they continued to negotiate. And finally, in 1891, June of 1891, they get permission to now place their monument on the battlefield, a negotiated 13 feet on the eastern side of the wall. So if you go to the next slide, there's the beautiful monument, and it is a beautiful monument, depicting not only the Zouave uniform, note the Zouave uniform, but the kind of fighting that took place at the wall. It is now one of the most photographed monuments on the battlefield. And if we go to the next slide, please. This is a look down the stone wall. I'm standing by the 69th Pennsylvania, over to the 71st Pennsylvania, and what do you see? 13 feet. 13 feet back, and the 69th Pennsylvania adds its company markers with a chain to be sure you know what the length of their line was. And we'll see it in another photograph. You'll see there's not a lot of space between the right flank marker of the 69th Pennsylvania and the left flank marker of the 71st Pennsylvania, but that's where this monument stands. So they ended up being generally happy about it, but I think they get the last laugh with this beautiful monument. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. This is Alexander Webb. He was 28 years old at Gettysburg. He's the brigade commander of the Philadelphia Brigade. He was placed in command of the Philadelphia Brigade 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. He has no command experience. He's been a staff officer for 2 years, well thought of, but no field experience at all, and he's a very tough disciplinarian. He's a West Point graduate, very tough guy, and there are several stories as the Philadelphia Brigade approaches Gettysburg about the kind of discipline he meted out. But the men come to respect him. He does a great job at Gettysburg, earning, at least initially, that loop road, right at the angle, Webb Avenue, and does a very good job here at Gettysburg. He is wounded at Gettysburg, back in service in 1864, wounded again at Spotsylvania. He's shot through the head at Spotsylvania. His obituary appears in the New York papers where he's from, and he survives. He'll finally die in 1911, but in the time between the Civil War and his death in 1911, he will be an instructor at West Point and the president of the College of New York City for many, many years, 25, 30 years, I think. So a very, very good guy, doing a lot of good work. This monument doesn't get dedicated until 1915. So for a lot of these portrait statues, it's private money that gets raised. You'll notice on this one, there's no Pennsylvania seal on this. So this was probably, I haven't looked at it, but probably all private money from his surviving comrades, from others who want to make sure that he gets memorialized on this battlefield. So that's Alexander Webb. It's unveiled at the dedication in 1915 by his granddaughter. Okay, next slide, please. We all recognize this, right? This is the Armistead wounding marker. And of course, there's a great story about how this gets placed on the battlefield. Of course, Lewis Armistead leads 200 to 300 Virginians up and over the wall at the height of Pickett's charge, and they come up over the wall right where that 72nd Pennsylvania monument stands today. We'll talk about why there's a place there for them to come up over the wall. Lewis Armistead, of course, is mortally wounded on July the 3rd, dies July the 5th at the Spangler Barn, the 11th Corps Hospital. Lewis Armistead, from North Carolina, New Bern, North Carolina, attends West Point. How does he get kicked out of West Point? Anybody know?
Fighting with Early?
Yeah, he breaks a plate over Jubal Early's head. We can all understand that. Apparently his grades were not great, but his family, he's got a father who served in the War of 1812 and 5 uncles who served in the War of 1812 in the U.S. Army. And of course his uncle George Armistead, where is he stationed during the War of 1812? Fort McHenry. He's in charge of the defense of Fort McHenry. And didn't come up with the Star-Spangled Banner, but he was there, right? So he has a very influential military family, and he gets a commission for the Mexican War and stays in the Army after that. Famously, he goes out to California before the Civil War, serves with Winfield Scott Hancock. They become good friends, probably not bosom buddies, but good friends. And then, once the war begins, goes south to serve with the Confederate Army. So the monument itself, the survivors of Pickett's division would like to plan a reunion at Gettysburg in the mid-1880s, and the Philadelphia Brigade wants to have a reunion as well. And so they start corresponding with each other and decide, well, golly, let's have a joint reunion. First time there's a joint reunion on the battlefield at Gettysburg, and probably one of the very first joint reunions of Union and Confederate soldiers. And all excited about this, Pickett's division writes to the Battlefield Association and says, we would like to put a marker on the spot where Lewis Armistead was wounded. And the answer is, no, not in your life. Well, they're not happy about it, and so they decide not to come. The heck with you all, we're not coming. Philadelphia Brigade jumps into action, starts lobbying, and persuades Pickett's division, yeah, come along, we'll have a grand old time. And of course, we've seen the photographs of these guys shaking hands across the stone wall during that joint reunion. And Pickett's division participates as the 69th Pennsylvania Monument is dedicated, the 71st Pennsylvania Monument is dedicated. And then 6 months later, in December of 87, magically this monument appears, right where they say Armistead was wounded. And although there's no clear evidence to it, it appears that there was a bit of a quid pro quo between the Battlefield Association and Pickett's division. They would be allowed to put this monument here. So they all came back for the dedication, and on the battle anniversaries, anybody been there during the July 3rd battle anniversary? There are always multiple Confederate flags on this monument, a very popular place to be. Next slide. It wouldn't be a full Hancock Avenue presentation without talking about the fences that are up on the battlefield. A lot of people ask about them. Again, this may be something you all know, but this is a fence that runs perpendicular to Hancock Avenue between two fields on the eastern side of Hancock Avenue, and it's a pig-tight cow-high fence. There are several styles of fences on the battlefield. We've already seen the stone walls. The stone walls generally are property boundaries. And the stone wall along Cemetery Ridge, where there's monuments to the 69th Pennsylvania and the 71st Pennsylvania reside, that stone wall separates the property of Nicholas Kodari along the Emmitsburg Road and Peter Fry, who owns the back part of Cemetery Ridge, the eastern side of Cemetery Ridge. So stone walls, when you see them, generally property boundaries. And what do we know about armies and stone walls in 1863? Well, they'll use what's there, but they don't enhance them. These Philadelphia Brigade soldiers spent the night on Cemetery Ridge right by that wall, and from all accounts did absolutely nothing to strengthen the wall, to heighten the wall, nothing. They would use it for protection when they could, but they had no orders to make it stronger for them, and it just wasn't part of what they typically did. What's going on Culp's Hill, all of those entrenchments that are being built, highly, highly unusual in 1863. So the stone walls stay about the way they are. These are rocks that if you've lived in the Gettysburg area, I don't quite know what the soil's like here, but in the Gettysburg area, you don't have to dig very far to find a big rock. And so as you're plowing fields, what they used to do was take the rocks, put them in the wagon behind the plow, get it over to the property boundary and dump. And so these walls are put up for that reason. We've also seen post and rail fences. They are typically along the roadways. You see them at the Emmitsburg Road. They will become obstacles for the soldiers. They're very secure fences. And during Pickett's charge, you'll hear a lot of the soldiers talk about the obstruction of those fences along the Emmitsburg Road. And then we have Virginia worm fences, which look a little bit like this without the stone part by the ground, kind of zigzaggy fences. They're not secured into the ground. The soldiers will tear most of those fences down, use the fencing for fires, for other things. And they're used by the farmers to put around their crops to keep the free-range grazing animals away from the crops as they grow. So this is a special version of one of these fences. Again, pig-tight, cow-high. The stones are going to keep the pigs out. And these nasty cross rails keep the grazing animals out, the cows, the horses. They'll keep them out of the field as well. So that's what you see in many places on the battlefield. And again, how do we know where they were? Warren's maps. They mark not only where the fences were, but what type of fence was there. Okay, let's see where we are time-wise. Uh-oh. Okay, let's do, next slide, and we'll do Alonzo Cushing's battery. Alonzo Cushing, 22 years old at Gettysburg, in charge. He's a West Point graduate, 1861, in charge of the battery up on Cemetery Ridge, one of the batteries. Obviously there are several. These are two of his guns. They are 3-inch ordnance rifles. And you can see 71st Pennsylvania Monument, 72nd Pennsylvania Monument, and you should be able to see not on this one, we'll find another photograph that shows the gap between the right flank of the 69th Pennsylvania, the left flank of the 71st Pennsylvania. Cushing's Battery is up there on July the 3rd, and they will be during the cannonade, have 4 guns disabled. He's got a 6-gun battery. 4 of those guns are disabled during the cannonade. Cushing is wounded in the shoulder during that cannonade, and then once Pickett's charge, those 12,500, give or take, Confederate soldiers line up along the tree line in the distance and start to come at the Union battle line. Cushing asks for permission to move his 2 remaining guns up to the stone wall, and they will fit right in where that 72nd Pennsylvania monument is, right between the other 2 Philadelphia Brigade regiments. They will be up there. They're out of everything but canister. And so they don't really fire until the Confederates reach the Emmitsburg Road, and then they begin firing double and triple canister. Once again, Cushing is wounded in the stomach, the groin, but he stays by the guns. Tries to give commands. His second in command will help him give commands to fire those cannon. And there's a great story that as he gives the final command to fire the last set of double canister, he's shot through the mouth and falls dead. His second in command has a slightly different story, and that is that that Cushing is shot before that last bit of fire from his cannon, laid down by the cannon, and then they fire that last final double canister. But the guns go silent because they're out of ammunition. And that's the spot Armistead finds to come up and over the wall and into the center of this Union battle line. So that's Cushing's Battery. If we go to the next slide, this is the text on that monument. Notice who put this monument up. 71st Pennsylvania. They are to the right of Cushing's Battery, and as Cushing's Battery begins to take casualties, they run out of artillerymen and the 71st Pennsylvania. The worst thing that can happen to an artillery battery is you gotta use infantry to fire the guns. They don't know what they're doing. But they will, in desperation, take some guys from the 71st Pennsylvania and continue to fire those cannon until they run out of ammunition. Most artillery batteries do not have many casualties. That's why it's so hard to get promoted in the artillery. Cushing's Battery, by contrast, lost 83 of its 90 horses. They had no workable wheels on any carriage when this was over. 9 ammunition chests were destroyed, and over 50% casualties. There's a great description written of what this area looks like at the end of Pickett's charge. The area surrounding the remains of Cushing's Battery was a wasteland of death and destruction. 3 batteries had been almost totally destroyed around the copse of trees. Fragments of exploded ammunition chests, limbers, and smashed wheels, dismounted guns, and gun carriages with broken axles littered the ground. Intertwined with the flotsam of war were the shredded carcasses of artillery horses and horribly disfigured gunners, living and dead. Most of the wounded were still on the line when the Confederate charge arrived. So, remarkable work done by this single battery on July the 3rd. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And I know I'm running out of time here.
No. Got about 20 minutes.
20? Oh, awesome. Okay. Okay, so on the Gettysburg battlefield, it's hard to take a picture on Cemetery Ridge without a bus in it. But the bus helps us locate Hancock Avenue, because they've got to stay on the road. So there's Hancock Avenue back there. And this is standing at the Cushing marker looking back, because, as I'm sure most of you know, this is the only place on the battlefield where they have the entire gun complement set up. So you've got the cannon here, the limber, it'll be separated from the limber, placed in firing position. The limber sits back a prescribed number of feet, and the artillery manuals are quite specific about how many feet behind the cannon the limber goes. There's an ammunition chest on the limber, and then if you look all the way on the other side of Hancock Avenue, you'll see the caisson. Another 3 ammunition chests pulled by another 6 horses. So 6 horses on the cannon and limber, 6 horses on the caisson, and as they're set up to fire, the horses get taken back as far away as they can, but they're mobility for the cannon. And so they can't be too far behind. So this is the setup, and then as we look at cannon on the battlefield, there were 600 at the time of the battle, give or take, more Northern than Confederate, but plenty, each side had plenty of cannon. And today on the battlefield, about 300. 80% of those 300 cannon are authentic Civil War era cannon. We know of only one for sure that was at the Battle of Gettysburg, and that's now at the base of John Buford's statue. But as you go around the battlefield, have you done this before? Which ones are authentic, which ones aren't?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, we don't need to do it then. Next slide, please. For those of you who have not, you can tell the real cannon from the replica cannon by looking at the muzzle of those cannon. And this one up on Cemetery Ridge will show you on that imprint on the muzzle, the place of manufacture. Phoenixville Iron Company is the manufacturer of all of the 3-inch ordnance rifles on the battlefield. The date of manufacture, this one 1862, could have been at Gettysburg, we don't know, all the records have been lost. And then the weight of just the barrel of the cannon, 817 pounds. That's why you need 6 big draft horses for these cannon. And then further around the barrel, you'll see the initials of the guy who inspected this cannon as it came off the line, JMW. And then further around clockwise, the number of the piece, and this one's what, 176? Cannon number 176. The Army loves paperwork. We all know that, right? And for those of you that have served, thank you for your service, and ignore the rest of what I'm going to say. They love paperwork, and that was no different during the Civil War than it is today. One of the guys on the gun crew's job was to write down every shell that this cannon fired. It's inventory control, right? There are no SKU codes on this. So his job was to write down what kind of ammunition they fired so that we keep inventory control. So that's why there's a number on every one of these pieces. And there should be a book that goes with the cannon that tells you what it fired, where, and when. But for most of these cannon, that's been lost. Okay, any questions so far? Yes?
The damage done to Cushing's Battery and the surrounding area, was that done by infantry or was that done by cannonade?
Cannonade. Yep. Yeah, there's this great story that all the shells went over Cemetery Ridge and hit Meade's headquarters and didn't really do much damage up on Cemetery Ridge. Yeah, it did. You can tell from, and Cushing's Battery is pretty well demolished by the cannonade, only 2 cannons left. And there's another battery, and I'm missing the name of it right now, but there's another battery that's withdrawn from Cemetery Ridge and replaced. So the benefit the Union Army had is that any of these cannons that were disabled, they could pull them off and put a fresh cannon in. And so the Confederates could do as much damage as you wanted to, but they still had Union cannon to replace the damaged ones. So yeah, that's all done by the cannonade. Anything else?
Was this the same guy a couple of years ago before the pandemic who was that was awarded the Medal of Honor?
Yes,
I thought, okay.
2014.
Yeah.
He's finally,
He made the news and everybody was saying about everything that he did down
Right.
there, and he finally
Yes.
decided after all this time that they awarded him posthumously or something like that, the Medal of Honor for...
right. It's initially, I think, the Medal of Honor couldn't be issued posthumously.
Oh, okay. Well,
And so I think those rules have changed now, and it was actually, and Cushing didn't leave much family behind. He's from Wisconsin, a single guy, so he has no direct ancestors. It's the woman who bought his house in Wisconsin, the old family house, that started to learn about him and started to put together the materials for the Medal of Honor. And then he had to find a relative, and he found some like third cousin, 12th removed or something. It's so that it could be presented to that relative. But yeah, 2014, he finally wins the Medal of Honor.
I thought, yeah.
Dan Sickles got his in 1895. Yeah, okay. Enough of Dan Sickles. We can do a whole program,
It's a
but
touchy
you don't
subject.
want me to do that, you want Jim Hessler to do that, yeah. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And we'll go to the next one. You guys know what the layout is of Hancock Avenue. So this is, of course, the high water mark, and this monument was prepared for the 25th anniversary of the battle. It's placed here, dedicated in 1892. They kind of missed the anniversary. It takes a while to do these monuments. But it's placed near the copse of trees. That was the aiming point, they say, for Pickett's charge. And it honors both Union and Confederate units that fought here. And the open book has those units on it and reads, "In recognition of the patriotism and gallantry displayed by their respective troops who met or assisted to repulse Longstreet's assaults." In the 1890s, it's called Longstreet's assault, right? Names have been changed to protect the innocent. Okay, so we got a couple of new kinds of cannon on this slide. The bronze guns that are up at the high water mark. These are actually in fighting condition. They're nice and polished up, so you can see that they're actually bronze. These are just like all the other bronze Napoleon smoothbore rifles. Smoothbore cannon that are across the battlefield. They're green. They just don't polish those up. But these they keep pretty well polished. And these also are authentic Civil War era cannon. You can read the muzzle pieces and see. So next time, homework, right? Next time you go, take a look at the muzzles of these Napoleons. You can easily read the information on them. Okay, next slide. This is Callens Battery. This is one of the other batteries up on Cemetery Ridge on July the 3rd. They were rushed in to help defend. They had been further down on Bigelow's line, further south on Hancock Avenue. And when one of the artillery units had to be pulled off its Callens Battery that was rushed up to the center of the line. They'll have one cannon to the north of the copse of trees and the other 5 to the south of the copse of trees. And they will, a couple of interesting things on the monument. I'm not sure if you can see it well. The cross on the monument. Yeah, they don't belong here with all those shamrocks. These guys come from the 6th Corps. And that's the benefit of having the 6th Corps just behind the line further south. You can push them into the fight anytime you want to. So these guys are 6th Corps cannon. And the description on this side, as we look at it, this side of the monument says, "During the cannonade preceding Longstreet's assault, the battery was engaged a short distance farther to the left, but by order of General Webb, it moved at a gallop to this position. Skirmishing had just commenced. The Confederate lines were over the defenses and within 10 yards of our guns. Our loss was 4 men and 14 horses killed. Compare that to Cushing's Battery. Okay, but these guys did good service. And on the opposite side of the monument, next slide, please. On the opposite side of the monument is another one of these beautiful bronze reliefs showing the action that these guys were part of, the desperation. You can see wounded horses laying on the ground, broken wheels, desperate men doing desperate things. What's unique about this bronze relief? It's the first Confederate flag on the battlefield. Right here is the first depiction of a Confederate flag on a monument on the battlefield. So it's known for that. This was dedicated again in 1887, so you can see they're getting ready for this 25th anniversary. Okay, next slide. This is John Gibbon, as I was trying to figure out who I could drop from this presentation. Unfortunately, John got added to that list. But his monument's there on the east side of Hancock Avenue. He was the division commander that included many of the units that we've been talking about. John Gibbon was another West Point graduate. He was age 36 at Gettysburg, and a lifelong soldier. He was wounded on July the 3rd, and a description left by one of his aides called Gibbon a tower of strength, cool as a steel knife always, and unmoved by anything and everything. But a very good commander. After the Civil War, he's stationed out west, fights in many of the Indian wars, and dies in 1896. This monument dedicated in 1988. So it takes him a while to get this monument. Okay, next slide. And will you tell me when I'm...
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yep.
I thought you might. Okay, this is the 20th Massachusetts Monument. It is along the wall, along the stone wall. Here it is, a little hard to see here. And this is, by the way, that traditional Virginia worm fence, the Kodari barn in the distance along the Emmitsburg Road. The 20th Massachusetts, known as, what's their nickname? The Harvard Regiment. They have a number of Harvard graduates. A couple of their officers are, actually one of their young officers had been accepted to Harvard, but the war came first. So he never made it back to Harvard. He did not survive the war. But this I kept here just to talk about the design of these monuments. Again, these survivors are designing monuments that are important, talking about things that are important to them, and doing things important to them, putting things on the monuments important to them. This 18-ton boulder was transported down from Roxbury, Massachusetts, where this regiment was recruited and organized. Many of the soldiers from that area, and it came from a playground where many of these soldiers had played as children. They brought it down, put it on the monument, and there it is. It's a unique one, and a lot of people ask about it. Dedicated in 1886. Okay, next slide. We all know what this is, right? Tammany, 5 minutes. Okay. Just enough time to talk about Tammany. You can't do this without talking about Dan Sickles, right? Okay, so Tammany Hall in New York in the 1800s is an extraordinarily powerful political group. We'll call them a group. It's actually, Tammany Society, formed in the 1700s, was an anti-immigrant society in the 1700s, and then as Irish immigrants pour into New York City in the 1800s, yeah, they decided it's probably not too bad to have all those Irish in their society as well, and so they become a Democrat powerhouse in New York, and they will run New York City by hook or by crook, a lot of it by crook, until the early 1900s when a reform mayor, anybody know who that is?
Roosevelt.
Fiorello LaGuardia, is elected and cleans out Tammany Hall and the other corruption that's rife in New York City if he could only have stayed, right? So this is also part of the competition that happens as these units are raised, and it stays with them so that when these monuments get placed, they all want to outdo each other. There were 2 regiments raised out of the Tammany Society. One is the 40th New York, the Mozart Regiment. And they've got, it's a nice monument down in, along Plum Run at the base of Little Round Top. But this one, these guys wanted to show they were more patriotic than anybody else. And they spent money. This is the most expensive regimental monument on the battlefield. It cost over $30,000. And what does this have to do with Tammany Hall?
That's where Dan Sickles came from.
Sorry?
Dan Sickles was part of that.
Well, he was part of that, yeah. This is actually not a Dan Sickles story, though. But yes, he was absolutely part of that. The Tammany Society used as its mascot and a lot of its terminology came out of the Native Americans that lived in the New York, New Jersey, Delaware area. Their meeting areas were called wigwams. Chief Tamanend, Delaware Indian, was their mascot. And if you go to the next slide, it's not real clear, but there's Chief Tamanend right in front. And every time we drive by, we do what we can to focus people on the left side of Hancock Avenue and the copse of trees. But invariably somebody says, oh, were there American Indians that fought here? No. But I'm convinced they designed it just for that purpose. So this monument is dedicated in 1891. It's partially funded by New York. If you go back a slide, partially funded by New York, you'll see the New York State seal on the monument. But the Tammany Society raised a huge amount of money to create this monument. And let's do one more. We'll do the U.S. Regulars Monument. Poor U.S. Regulars kind of get short shrift as well. When it came time to put monuments on the battlefield, we all know there was a small group of U.S. regular soldiers. These are real soldiers, right, not volunteers. They were throughout the artillery. Cushing's Battery is a U.S. battery. So a lot of artillery batteries, some cavalry, some infantry, all U.S. regular soldiers. So they were in the regular U.S. Army, not the volunteer Army. But they participated at Gettysburg. And when the United States decided to put some monuments up, they put very plain stone slabs up for each of these monuments, for each of these U.S. Army groups. And then by the early 1900s, seeing some of the magnificent art on this battlefield, they decided that those U.S. regular soldiers needed something a little bit more special. So in 1909, they constructed this monument to honor those U.S. regular soldiers. All right, so I'm going to stop there, but I want to leave you with this, just to give you a sense of how important these monuments are. Not only to what we see on the battlefield, they help us interpret the battle, but how important they were for the soldiers that designed these monuments and placed these monuments. In connection with the dedication, when they dedicated these monuments, they didn't just bring a truck and plop the monument down and they were done. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you're fine. They had ceremonies. And periodically, we'll see groups of people from various states come back and rededicate monuments. So this was a big deal. There were speeches, there were bands, there were prayers, there were, all the veterans came back with their families, and you got photographs with it. And so to give you a sense of how important these monuments were to these soldiers, At one of those dedications, this is part of the speech. I hope I make it through it. Here we raise this monument, that you may learn to love your country more by knowing what it cost than that you may know that it came out of the furnace fires of 1861 to 1865, regenerated and purified, redeemed not by gold and silver, but by the blood of our brothers, fathers, and friends. Here in the years to come, this battlefield shall be the Mecca, and this monument one of the shrines, at which patriotism shall come to offer her devotions. Here our children and our children's children and the children of unborn generations shall come to pay tribute to undying valor and heroism. That's what these are about. Thank you. Any questions? I had to do that for my oral exam, and I had to read it over and over and over again so I could get through it. It's been a while. Any questions? Yes?
It's okay to feel like that.
Thank you.
You're among friends here.
Yep.
The Armstead Monument.
Yep.
I heard some rumors, because he was a Mason, that the Masons exerted an awful lot of influence to get that placed on the battlefield. And not because of the rumor about him and Hancock.
Right.
Hancock wasn't even near where he was.
I have not read that, but it wouldn't surprise me, because there were Masons all over
Yeah.
this
They
battlefield.
looked after each other. Especially
Very
after
much.
the war, they got a little bit tighter.
Yeah, very much so. So that doesn't surprise me. There's very little written about how this suddenly finds itself on the battlefield, so that wouldn't surprise me at all. Yeah. Anybody else? I put you to sleep. Okay.
Good job.
All
Well
right.
done.
Good.
Very good. What? Hello?
Okay, again, I want to thank Mary for this great talk. And just a reminder, next month we have Rick.
I know that guy.
Baldy, he's going to be talking about the Teamsters. So might have to do some cussing now. But also, Mary, what I'd like to do is give you our first book.
Thank you.
Hope to see more of you guys.
I feel like C.J. Craig when Bartlett made her wear the Notre Dame.
Hey, I do have a question. Is it true that when they put these monuments up, that they had to face the enemy?
They were supposed to face the way the soldiers faced.
Right.
So they're facing.
So like at
in
Meade,
the direction.
when they put Meade up, he was supposed to be facing Lee.
Well, Lee wasn't up yet.
Well, I know, but
Yeah.
the Confederate line.
Well, I think they wanted me facing the Confederate line, and it works on Cemetery Ridge. But if you look over at East Cemetery Hill, you got Hancock over there.
What?
It's not facing anything.
And I have another question that really bothers me over the years that I've been studying.
Yeah.
Why was it called Pickett's Charge when only 3 of his divisions of the 9 that fought?
Yep.
Because it was basically, you mentioned Longstreet's assault. That's what it should have been called. So why did they come up with this social term that it was Pickett's
So
Charge?
it should be its own program on remembrance and how we remember what happened at Gettysburg. Immediately after the battle, the people, the Southern commanders that are criticized for what they did at Gettysburg, Lee, Stewart, Ewell, nobody criticized Longstreet. And because Longstreet was in charge of the attack, it starts to be called Longstreet's assault. And then what happens to Longstreet after the war? He becomes very unpopular in the South.
Yeah.
Right?
Because he went to a
becomes
different
Republican.
party. He went to a
He
different
writes some
party.
stuff about Lee, and there are a whole bunch of reasons for it. And so nobody wants to call it Longstreet's assault anymore because it's unpopular. So they start to call it the Pickett-Pettigrew Trimble Charge.
Right.
Well, that rolls right off your tongue. Those are the 3 divisions that are involved in the charge. Where's George Pickett from?
Virginia,
Where in Virginia?
near Richmond somewhere.
Richmond. Where are all the newspapers?
Richmond,
Richmond. Richmond needs a hero.
yes, they do.
And so they begin to refer to it as Pickett's charge. So it's all this remembrance thing. And, with a lot of people, we talk about who's writing this history, and of course, the adage that it's the victors that write the history. Well, that's not what happened in the Civil War. It's the South that writes a whole lot of the history. That's how Lee becomes this,
Lost cause stuff. Yeah.
well, you get the Lost
All that,
Cause, you get Jubal Early and Pendleton writing in the Southern Historical Society, trashing Long Street to elevate Lee
Yep.
to this almost mythical status. And that's how a lot of this happens. By then, the North has moved on. It's time to move on, time of Reconstruction's over. The South is still making heroes.
Or the other side of the story is, since all the troops moved through the area where Pickett's buffet is, they named it after the buffet.
That's how that name got started, right? Yeah.
That's what stopped it.